Our journey today begins in London, in 1637, inside the royal court of King Charles I. Here, in chambers thick with ceremony and caution, words are weighed carefully, every glance is measured, every sentence rehearsed. This is a place where power listens only to what it expects to hear. And yet, for years, one man has been permitted to speak differently. He mocks, he punctures, he shortens pride into silence. And his name is Archibald Armstrong, the King's Jester. Today, a line will be crossed. A remark that once would have passed as laughter will no longer be forgiven. The words are delivered as they always have been, plainly, economically, with his signature wit honed from decades of service. And for a moment, nothing happens. But then the king's expression hardens, conversations falter, and the ease drains from the room. The guards step forward, and Armstrong is led from the chamber, never to return. This marks the moment when power decided it no longer wished to hear the truth, when it no longer dared to imagine it might be wrong. That was the role of Archibald Armstrong, often described as the last true court jester in history. To understand how this happened and why it mattered, we must go back to a different time, a time when the mighty actively employed someone to laugh at them and get them to reconsider and potentially change their actions. Great power has a recurrent problem. As authority accumulates, truth finds it increasingly difficult to reach the center. Courts, by their very nature, reward caution rather than candor, and those who survive near power learn quickly that accuracy is less valuable than alignment, and that silence is often safer than correction. Over time, this creates an environment rich in affirmation, but poor in insight, a place where agreement circulates freely, while reality struggles to be heard. Rulers are therefore surrounded by praise, yet increasingly isolated from the consequences of their own decisions. This danger was not always invisible. Many rulers in the past understood that unchecked flattery distorted judgment, that courts insulated from contradiction drifted towards overconfidence, and that authority left unchallenged developed blind spots that no amount of loyalty could correct. In response, they adopted an unusual solution. A role was created for someone to pass comment on the lives and actions of the elite. But rather than to entrust this to the nobles, whose proximity to power bred ambition, or to advisers, whose words might be mistaken for policy, they instead created space for a voice that stood apart from the hierarchy, a commoner, the court jester. Chosen from outside rank, office and advancement, the jester had no political future to protect. That was precisely the point. Because he sought neither favour nor promotion, he could be trusted to say what others would not. His role was not to govern nor advise, but to interrupt ceremony, ridicule certainty, and expose vanity without immediate reprisal. The jester provided a check where none otherwise existed. He spoke truth in the form of humour, using mockery to deliver what could not safely be said plainly. In doing so, he created a brief but vital space in which even the most powerful ruler might be forced to reflect, and to see themselves as others did. In this sense, the court jester functioned as an early internal critic. Long before parliaments or free presses, he was permitted to question appearances, puncture official narratives, and test the assumptions of power from within. Modern depictions of jesters tend to emphasize costume, noise, and foolish antics, but this image is misleading when taken as the whole truth. His costume and spectacle mark the jester as socially untouchable, a figure operating outside the normal rules, and his humour provided cover for something more dangerous, criticism. Beneath the bells and absurdity sat a licensed freedom to reduce power to human scale, and as the old saying had it, many a truth was indeed said in jest. In England, Will Sommers fulfilled this role for more than 3 decades. Trusted by Henry VIII, he remained close through religious upheaval, political purges, and the rise and fall of queens. Sommers outlived policy's rivals, and even the king himself, not by accident, but because his presence was useful. He could say what others learned to swallow. In France, Triboulet served both Louis XII and Francis I during periods of consolidation and court rivalry. His value lay not in entertaining the crown, but in managing those around it. By ridiculing noble pretension and exposing courtly arrogance, he helped deflate factional tension without forcing the king into direct confrontation. His wit stabilized authority by keeping ambition in check. In Poland and Lithuania, Stanczyk was remembered not for light entertainment, but for political seriousness. Contemporary accounts and later tradition cast him as a jester who grasped national danger before others were willing to acknowledge it. A figure permitted to speak plainly in a court reluctant to hear uncomfortable truths. And so, across Europe, from England and France to the German states, Italy, Spain, Poland, and beyond, the pattern repeated for centuries. Power permitted itself to be mocked because it feared something worse. Self-deception. But this permission was never guaranteed. It depended on a shared understanding that authority could survive ridicule, that truth was worth the discomfort, and that laughter was not rebellion. By the early 17th century, that understanding was thinning across many European courts. In England, the permission to speak still existed, but only just, and in the court of King Charles I, it rested with one man alone, our last true court jester, Archibald Armstrong. Archibald Armstrong was Scottish by birth. Shaped in the culture of James VI's court from the early 1590s, he was already known for a manner of speech that paid little regard to rank. Hailing from the border regions, he was formed in a society where sharp language functioned as social leverage, and he embodied the qualities prized in a successful court jester: an instinctive ease with friction, and an ability to speak plainly in spaces where others were too afraid. This was not mere insolence, it was a skill, recognized early and preserved because it served a purpose. Armstrong would go on to serve King James faithfully for roughly 25 years, following him into England in 1603, and remaining within the royal household until and beyond James's death in 1625. He would outlive the king and continue into the early years of Charles I's reign before his employment was abruptly ended in 1637. James's regard for Armstrong was such that, when he inherited the English throne and carried his court south, he brought Armstrong with him, instead of employing a more English-orientated jester. This was of no surprise, of course, as James was known as a ruler who prized intellect, disputation, and verbal dexterity. He enjoyed appearing self-assured in the face of challenge, and he was secure enough to allow himself to be contradicted, as long as that contradiction arrived wrapped in wit. Within such an environment, Armstrong was able to flourish, as the court of James VI understood the value of being unsettled. Armstrong's reputation was not built on a single famous jest, nor on a catalogue of quotable remarks. What distinguished him was consistency. He was known to speak freely where others learned to remain silent, and he did so often enough that his role became predictable and dependable. Although courtiers often complained about his barbs, they did not retaliate against him, a telling detail that suggests his speech was understood as institutionally useful. He had become, in effect, an accepted component of the machinery of monarchy. Furthermore, the longevity of Armstrong's position was not trivial. He remained at court through years of religious anxiety and political manoeuvring, including the unstable settlement James struggled to maintain in the decades following the Reformation. These were not calm years, yet Armstrong endured because he understood the boundaries of the role and how to play it well. His mockery did not seek to undermine authority, only to remind it of itself. Under James, the king could afford to be laughed at, and in doing so, he signalled confidence rather than weakness. When James died in 1625, Charles I inherited the throne, the court, the machinery of kingship, and therefore the court jester. He had grown up with Armstrong's presence and would have been fully familiar with his role, but he did not inherit his father's ease with contradiction. Under Charles, the court placed greater emphasis on reverence, order, and certainty, and the kind of licensed mockery Armstrong represented began to sit uneasily within this new tone. For more than a decade, Armstrong remained speaking as he always had, while the boundaries around him quietly tightened. The threshold of what was tolerated narrowed year by year, and so, by the mid-1630s, the words of the Jester were no longer considered a laughing matter. By the mid-1630s, the conditions that had once sustained Archibald Armstrong's license no longer existed. The court had already changed, as had its outlook, and all that remained was the question of whether the old role of a court jester could still function within it. The moment of transgression that answers this as an emphatic no was never formally recorded. No court minute preserves the remark, no witness transcribed the exchange, but the nature of Armstrong's offence is not entirely opaque, because after his dismissal he chose to publish the kind of speech that had once kept him employed, and so we get an insight into the man and his ways. In 1640, Armstrong released A Banquet of Jests, and its targets are consistent and revealing. Again and again, Armstrong directs his wit at senior clergy and moral authorities, especially bishops who confuse office with wisdom and certainty with virtue. One jest mocks a prelate who thundered from the pulpit as though God had borrowed his lungs, while another observes that a bishop's sermon is like a storm at sea, much noise and little fishing. These were not jokes about faith, they were jokes about pretense, about men who mistook their position for divine endorsement. However, Armstrong's continued outspokenness about the clergy did not take into account that the political landscape had shifted. Indeed, by 1637, Archbishop William Laud dominated Charles I's religious policy. Laud's programme emphasised hierarchy, ritual, and obedience, and it included little tolerance for mockery. Sacred authority was no longer something to be lightly reduced to human scale. What Armstrong had once delivered as corrective humour now landed dangerously close to the ideological foundations of the Crown itself. It is likely that the remark which ended his career belonged to this register, a jest aimed not directly at the man, but at the moral and clerical certainty that surrounded and supported his kingship. Under James, such a comment would be circulated as wit, but under Charles, the reaction was decisive. Armstrong was dismissed from court in 1637 and explicitly forbidden to return. There was no inquiry, no defence, and no appeal. The system that had once absorbed mockery simply refused to recognise it. The permission Armstrong had once held was no longer acknowledged. He was ordered away from London and sent into provisional exile, likely in Lincolnshire, cut off from the court that had defined his adult life. There would be no replacement. No new jester was appointed. The role itself was not reformed or revised. It was ended. In removing Armstrong, the court did not silence criticism. It displaced it. What could no longer be spoken under the protection of humour would soon surface elsewhere, in pamphlets, sermons, and public argument, stripped of loyalty, stripped of affection, and stripped of restraint. When Archibald Armstrong left the court, he took with him more than just his voice. He took the last surviving licence to laugh at power from within. And the court that remained would soon discover what it meant to govern without it. Although it would be madness to claim that losing Archibald Armstrong caused the civil war that erupted 5 years after his dismissal, his removal does offer a revealing insight into how the king understood power. It exposes a growing intolerance for contradiction, one that would later crystallise in Charles's catastrophic breakdown of relations with Parliament. Keeping Armstrong at court would not in itself have prevented these events, but it is difficult not to wonder whether a ruler more receptive of self-reflection, more willing to absorb discomfort, might have chosen differently. In the years following Armstrong's dismissal, Charles became increasingly isolated from contradiction. His counsel narrowed, his certainty hardened, and without an internal space where power could be mocked without consequence, disagreement was forced outward. Criticism no longer arrived softened by humour or loyalty. It returned sharpened, public, and it returned with an army. Jesters, despite their license, were rarely dismissed and almost never killed. To silence one too harshly was to confirm the truth of whatever had last been said. Most rulers understood this instinctively. Armstrong's removal was therefore unusual, and the irony that followed is difficult to miss. The king who could not tolerate being laughed at would ultimately be judged in a court that permitted no reverence at all. When the axe fell in 1649, there was no jester present to soften the moment, only silence and the crowd. Archibald Armstrong's true legacy was arguably the 25 years he spent beside King James I. A commoner in a court of nobles, he survived where others rose and fell, not by birth or title, but by wit alone. His book, A Banquet of Jests, gives us a rare connection to the man, and to the voice that made power uncomfortable, for the benefit of all. It is a collection of brief, biting anecdotes mocking every rung of the hierarchy. One theme threads quietly through its pages. He delights in exposing those who speak with absolute assurance, not because they are correct. Armstrong's purpose was never to provide final answers, but it was to prick the surface of certainty and let a little doubt in. It is not difficult to imagine how he might have treated this story itself. A tidy conclusion, and the comfort of thinking a lesson or a cautionary tale has been delivered. No doubt he would have found something to mock, and on that point he would almost certainly have been right, even if only for a whisper in time.